I spent most of my life believing that needing someone was a weakness, so I became very good at being alone. Not the loud kind of alone, not the kind that announces itself with tears or empty weekends, or the visible grief of someone who has lost something. The quiet kind. The kind that looks from the outside, like strength. I learned how to carry my own problems, how to wipe my own tears in the bathroom before returning to whatever room I had left them in, how to pay my own bills and solve my own problems, and walk away from things before they could walk away from me. When I moved from Nairobi to Seoul, I told myself I wasn't lonely. I was independent. There is a difference. I told myself that many times, and then I met a man who never once tried to rescue me from myself. He didn't tell me I was too strong. He didn't ask me to become softer for his convenience. He didn't arrive with grand gestures or declarations, or the performed warmth of someone who wants to be credited for their own kindness. He simply noticed when I was tired. He brought coffee when I forgot to eat. He waited when I was walking slowly, and without making any promise about it, without announcing it or requiring acknowledgement, he kept showing up. At first I didn't understand why that frightened me, and then I understood. I wasn't afraid he would hurt me. I was afraid that for the first time in my adult life I might actually want someone to stay. This is the story of how I learned that being strong doesn't mean you have to be alone, and how long it took me to understand the difference. Let me tell you about the woman I was before Seoul. Not the professional version, not the version with the CV and the career trajectory and the organized apartment, the actual woman. The one underneath the performance of competence that I had been giving since approximately the age of 9. My name is Wanjiru Mwangi, 31 years old at the beginning of this story, from Nairobi, Kenya. Though the version of Nairobi I grew up in is the version that exists in the texture of specific mornings rather than in any postcard image of the city. The smell of my mother's kitchen at 6:30 in the morning when she was making uji before school. The sound of the neighbor's radio through the wall on Saturday mornings, playing the kind of music that existed before it had a genre name and simply was what Saturday mornings sounded like. The quality of the Nairobi afternoon light at around 4 o'clock when the day has softened its ambition, and the air has a warmth that is not hot, but simply present. I grew up in a home that was full of love. I want to say that clearly because the story I am about to tell might suggest a childhood of damage, and I do not want to be dishonest about the origin of what I became. My mother loved me with the full available resources of a woman who had decided that her children would not carry the uncertainties of her own childhood forward into their lives. She worked long hours. She was precise about education. She had opinions about effort that were non-negotiable, and that I absorbed so completely that I can no longer separate her voice from my own interior monologue about the relationship between work and outcome. She said to me once, when I was 8 years old and had been sitting at the kitchen table, waiting for my older brother to help me with a mathematics problem he had promised to help me with and had not returned for, "Wanjiru, if you can do something yourself, don't wait for someone else to do it." She said it with warmth. She was not dismissing me. She was offering me something she genuinely believed was a tool. She was right that it was a tool. What she did not know, what I did not know for many years afterward, was that I would take that tool and build an entire architecture with it. A way of being in the world that worked perfectly well across every domain except the one that mattered most. Have you ever learned something from someone you love that served you beautifully in one area of your life and quietly dismantled another? That is what I did with my mother's sentence. I learned to solve my own problems. I learned to not wait for people. I learned that the gap between what you need and what arrives is a gap you can fill yourself if you are willing to work hard enough at the filling. This is a true and useful thing, and it became, over time, the sentence I used to justify never asking anyone for help with anything that actually mattered. Let me tell you about Nairobi before Seoul. I was a project coordinator for an urban development NGO, work I believed in, the kind of work that contains genuine stakes alongside the professional ones, whether communities had access to sanitation infrastructure, whether the gap between what a city promised and what it delivered could be narrowed by the accumulated effort of people who had decided the narrowing was worth their time. I was good at the work. I had friends, real ones, the kind that develop over years of shared context and occasional difficult conversations, and the particular intimacy that comes from people who have known you long enough to know the difference between your public register and your private one. My friend Zainab was this person. She had known me since our first year at university and had the specific quality of someone who could look at me across a table and identify, with considerable accuracy, what I was not saying. She said to me once, approximately 2 years before I left for Seoul, "You know what your problem is," I said. "I'm certain you're going to tell me." She said, "You're better at being there for people than you are at letting people be there for you." I looked at her. She said, "It makes people feel like they can't contribute anything to you, like you don't actually need them." I said, "I don't need help." She said, "That's not what I mean." I said, "Then what do you mean?" She said, "I mean that sometimes people want to matter to you, and you don't let them. You take care of everything yourself, and then wonder why you feel alone." I went home that evening and thought about what she said, and then I decided she was projecting and made myself a cup of tea. The relationship that ended before Seoul. His name was David, 33, a civil engineer whose precision with structures extended, in ways I initially found reassuring and later found revealing, into how he thought about relationships. We were together for 2 years. He was, by any measure that I was capable of applying at the time, a good man. He was kind. He was consistent. He made plans and kept them. He cooked on the evenings he said he would cook and showed up on the days he said he would show up, and was, in the language of people who talk about relationships, present. He said to me, in the last conversation we had, before he said what he actually needed to say, "Wanjiru, you never let me do anything for you." I looked at him. I said, "That's not true. You help me all the time." He said, "I mean the things that matter." I said, "I don't know what you mean." He said, "I know, that's what I mean." He did not say it cruelly. He said it with the specific sadness of someone who has been trying to reach something for a long time and has arrived at the understanding that the reaching is not going to produce the result they were reaching for. We ended, not with drama, with the quiet dissolution of something that had been losing its foundation for longer than either of us had been willing to name. I cried once, in the bathroom, with the tap running. And then I made my tea and called my mother, and did not mention it because there was nothing to be done, and mentioning it would only produce concern that I did not have the bandwidth to receive. Seoul arrived as an opportunity the following year. My organization was partnering with a Korean municipal development initiative. They needed someone from the East Africa desk who could manage the partnership's documentation and community engagement framework. They needed someone with Korean language aptitude who was willing to learn. I had been taking Korean evening classes for 6 months because I had read about the partnership 6 months before it was offered, and had decided that being prepared for an opportunity was more useful than being surprised by it. I am still not entirely certain where that tendency comes from. I got the position. Zainab helped me pack. She cried. I did not. Which she noticed and which she accepted, because she knew me well enough to understand that the not crying was not the absence of feeling but the management of it. My mother made me 3 containers of food that I carried onto the plane in my carry-on, alongside my laptop and my Korean phrase book. She held my face in both hands at the airport. She said, "Call me when you land." I said, "I will." She said, "And Wanjiru?" I said, "Yes." She said, "You don't have to do everything alone just because you can." I looked at her. She looked back at me. And we both understood, in the way of mothers and daughters who have known each other for 31 years, that she was not talking about the move. I hugged her. I got on the plane. Seoul was everything I had prepared myself for, and nothing I had prepared myself for. The logistics were exactly as I had studied them. The subway system was the most reliable I had ever encountered. The administrative processes were organized with a precision that Nairobi's corresponding processes had not yet achieved. The food was extraordinary and foreign in a way that I found genuinely interesting rather than alienating, because I had decided before I arrived that I would find it interesting rather than alienating. These are the things I had prepared for. What I had not prepared for was the quality of the silence in my apartment at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night. The specific texture of a city that does not know you exist. Nairobi had always known I existed. Not as a public figure. In the way that a place knows you when you have been inside it long enough for your presence to have settled into the ordinary landscape of it. The woman at the market near my apartment, who had been selling tomatoes from the same spot for as long as I had been buying them, and who called me by name. The specific quality of being somewhere that has your texture built into its texture. Seoul did not have my texture yet, and building it takes time. And in the interim there is the specific loneliness of someone in a remarkable place who is not yet remarkable to it. I told myself this was temporary. I was right. But temporary can last a long time when you are inside it. My professional world was full and engaging. My personal world was carefully managed. I had colleagues I ate lunch with. I had Ji Young, a Korean colleague who had made it her personal mission to help me navigate the social architecture of our office, and who had the warm efficiency of someone who believed that her personal network was a public good. I had Sunday video calls with Zainab and my mother. I had the Korean language class that met on Tuesday evenings and that was producing genuine results. I had, in other words, a life. But nobody knew when I was hurting. This was not an accident. I had organized it that way. The same way I had organized everything. With full competence and complete control. And on a Thursday afternoon in October, when I had been in Seoul for 7 months, and had successfully convinced myself that the organized, competent life I had built was sufficient, I met him. Not in a meaningful way, not with the quality of a meeting that announces itself as significant. We were both at the Community Volunteering Center, 2 blocks from my office, where Ji Young had convinced me to spend Thursday afternoons helping with a project supporting elderly residents with administrative navigation. He was already there when I arrived. He was helping an elderly man understand a healthcare document with the patient attention of someone who understood that the document was not the point, and the person holding it was. I sat at the table across the room. I began my work. At some point in the afternoon, he passed my table. He looked at me. Not intrusively, not with the performed concern of someone manufacturing a connection. He simply looked at me with the quality of someone who has noticed something and is deciding whether to acknowledge it. And then he said, "You look like you could use a coffee." I looked up. I said, "I'm fine." He said, "I didn't ask if you were fine." I looked at him. He said, "I just thought you might want coffee." He placed a cup beside my materials and walked back to his table. I stared at the cup and sat with the specific quality of something bothering me in a way I could not immediately account for, because nobody had placed something beside me without asking whether I needed it first. And I had not known until that moment that I had been waiting for someone to do exactly that. I spent years learning how to survive without needing anyone. I did not know yet that the most quietly dangerous person I could ever meet would be someone who never asked me to need him. His name was Kwon Seong-jin, 33 years old. He worked in urban infrastructure planning for the Seoul municipal government. A role that, as I learned over the weeks that followed, he had chosen because he believed that the quality of public space was one of the most reliable indicators of how much a city actually valued the people living in it. He was not wealthy. He had a modest apartment in Mapo, and a second-hand car that he drove on the weekends, and a preferred table at a specific cafe on Mapo Dero, where the owner knew his order and brought it without being asked. He was not extraordinary in any of the ways that people typically mean when they describe someone as extraordinary. He was simply, in a way that I would spend months understanding the full significance of, consistent. He showed up to the volunteering center every Thursday. He brought coffee approximately twice a month without pattern or announcement. He asked questions and listened to the answers with the quality of someone who was actually going to retain what they were told. And he never once pushed past the boundaries I was maintaining. This last quality is the one I want to explain carefully, because it is the one that I did not initially recognize as a quality. I am accustomed to 2 categories of response when people encounter my independence. The first is admiration. People who find it impressive and who respond to it by giving me more space and less closeness because they have interpreted my capability as a preference for distance. The second is challenge. People who find it unsettling and who respond to it by trying to prove that they can get through it, by pushing, by requiring vulnerability before I have decided to offer it, by interpreting my self-sufficiency as a wall they are entitled to climb. Seong-jin did neither. He simply remained present at the distance I indicated was comfortable, and waited, not passively, not with the performing patience of someone who wanted credit for endurance, simply present, available, without requiring anything from the availability. I found this, for reasons I could not initially articulate, deeply unsettling. Let me explain the pattern. because you need to understand it if you are going to understand this story, and because I am at a point in my life now where I have earned the right to name it clearly. The pattern worked like this. Someone would approach. I would register the approach. I would become, in the interior place that nobody had access to, quietly alarmed. Not by the person, by what the person represented, the possibility of mattering. And I would, in the practiced, efficient way that I did everything, begin withdrawing. Not rudely, I was never rude. Professionally, with the specific language of someone who is very busy and who respects you enormously, but who simply does not have the available space for the level of closeness you are gesturing toward. And they would notice. Because people always notice, even if they cannot articulate what they have noticed. And they would back away, and I would register their backing away as confirmation of the thing I had always believed. People leave, eventually, in one way or another. The pattern was self-fulfilling. I was creating the ending I was trying to protect myself from. And I did not know this. Or rather, I knew it intellectually. I had thought about it. I had even said it aloud to Zainab once, late at night on a video call when the Seoul apartment was quiet around me, and I was feeling the specific weight of a long week that had not produced any human warmth worth remembering. I said, I think I push people away before they can leave. Zainab said, yes, I said. I know that's not healthy. She said, knowing something and doing something about it are not the same thing. I said, I know. She said, you just said I know again. I said, I know. We both laughed, but it was the laugh of people who know that the conversation is true and have not yet arrived at the part where the truth produces a change in behavior. Our conversations began developing in the weeks after the coffee. Not through arrangement, through the natural consequence of two people who occupy the same Thursday afternoon space and who have discovered through a series of brief professional exchanges that they are compatible conversationalists. We talked about the volunteering work, about the specific administrative challenges of elderly residents navigating Seoul's healthcare and housing systems, about the gap between what bureaucratic language communicates and what it actually means. I told him about the corresponding gap in Nairobi, about the specific texture of navigating municipal systems in a city where the gap between the official process and the actual process was sometimes wider than the documentation suggested. He was genuinely interested, not performed interest. The kind that asks follow-up questions that reveal the previous answer has actually been absorbed. He asked about Kenya with the curiosity of someone who understood that curiosity was a form of respect. I told him about Nairobi the way I told everyone about Nairobi, the professional version, the version with the statistics and the development trajectory, and the cultural context that a foreigner could absorb and file correctly. He received all of this, and then he asked, "What do you miss most?" I looked at him. He said, "Not the professional answer. What do you actually miss?" I sat with that for a moment. I said, "The sound of my mother's kitchen on Sunday mornings when she is making tea." He was quiet. I said, "It is a completely ordinary sound. There is nothing remarkable about it. But I have not heard it in 8 months, and I notice its absence in a way I did not anticipate." He said, "I think the ordinary things are often the ones that carry the most." I said, "Yes." He said, "What does Kenyan tea taste like?" I described it to him. The ratio of tea to milk that most people outside of a Kenyan household consider extreme. The specific quality of the cardamom. The temperature of it. The cup it is served in. He listened to the whole description with the attention of someone memorizing something. And I noticed, as I was talking, that I was not giving him the professional answer. I was giving him the actual answer, and I did not know what to do with the recognition of that. The first disagreement happened on a Thursday afternoon in January. We had been talking for 3 months, not dating, not in any way that either of us had named or was managing toward a name. Simply 2 people in the same space, having conversations that had gradually exceeded the professional threshold and entered something more honest without either of us having formally decided to cross into it. He had been watching me manage a particularly complex situation with one of the elderly residents, a woman who had received an eviction notice that she did not understand and that I had spent 2 hours working through with her, because the notice contained a procedural error that, if addressed correctly through the right channel in the right language, could be resolved. I resolved it. He watched, and afterward he said, "You know, you could have asked the organization's legal contact for help with that. It would have taken you 20 minutes instead of 2 hours. I said, "I knew how to handle it." He said, "I know you knew how." That's not what I said. I looked at him. He said, "You don't always have to do everything yourself." And something in me reacted to this in the way that it always reacted to variations of this sentence, with the specific defensiveness of someone who has been told something true that they are not ready to receive. I said, "I don't need help. I handled it." He said, "Why does everyone keep saying that?" I said, "Because you make needing people sound like failure." I walked away from the table. I went to the bathroom. I ran the tap for 40 seconds. And when I came back, he had reorganized the materials we had been working with and was sitting at the table with 2 cups of tea and an expression that was not apologetic and was not retracted, but was simply present. He said nothing else about it. He handed me a cup. I sat down. We worked until the session ended. And on the train home I thought about what he had said. Not immediately, not with the willing honesty of someone ready to examine themselves. But the thought was there, working. In the quiet way of things that have been told to you correctly, and that your interior is processing regardless of whether your surface has consented to the processing. There is a distinction I did not understand until that January. I had always believed that my pattern of self-sufficiency was about avoiding abandonment, about the fear that people would leave and that I would be left holding the weight of having needed them. But sitting on the train that evening, I arrived at a different understanding. It was not the leaving I was afraid of. It was the mattering, specifically, the terrifying possibility of being dependent enough on another person's presence that their departure would actually hurt. Because if you never let someone matter, their absence costs you nothing. You cannot be bereaved by the departure of someone whose presence you were managing at arm's length, and I had been managing everyone at arm's length, not because I did not feel things, because I felt them too much to risk them being taken. The train moved through Seoul. I looked at my reflection in the dark window and thought, this is not independence. This is a very organized form of preemptive grief. The phone call from Nairobi came on a Friday night. My brother Kamau's voice had a quality I recognized immediately, because it was the quality of someone who has decided to say something difficult and has opened the sentence before they were fully ready. He said, "Mama is in hospital." He said it had been caught early. He said the doctors were confident. He said there was nothing for me to do from Seoul, because there was nothing anyone was being asked to do except wait, and the waiting did not require my physical presence, and he did not want me to panic. I thanked him for calling. I hung up. I sat in my apartment in the quiet of a Friday night in Seoul, and I did what I always did with difficult things. I picked up my laptop. I opened my work files. I began finding things that needed doing. I worked until 2 in the morning. The following Thursday at the volunteering center, Seong-jin looked at me when I arrived with the expression of someone who has noticed a change in the weather and is deciding whether to name it. He did not push. He did not ask directly. At the end of the session when we were gathering materials, he simply said, "If you need me, I'm here." Not, "What's wrong?" Not, "You don't seem like yourself." Not, "Let me help you." Simply, "If you need me, I'm here." I said I know. And I noticed, as I said it, that this time I was not managing the words. I meant them. And that was not a small thing, because I meant it not as social courtesy, but as the honest acknowledgement that there was a person in the world whose presence I would find useful if I needed it. And I had not been able to say that about anyone in Seoul until that moment, and perhaps not about anyone in some time before that. Let me tell you what he was like, not what he said about himself. What I observed. Because trust is not built from what a person tells you about their character. It is built from the accumulated evidence of how they behave when nobody is requiring anything of them. He kept promises, not the large promises that people make with ceremony and that sometimes fail under the weight of their own ambition. The small ones. He said once in passing that he would send me information about a specific community infrastructure project in the Mapo neighborhood that related to something I had mentioned about my own work in Nairobi. He sent it the following day with a brief note that contextualized the elements that were relevant to what I had described. He had been listening accurately enough to know which elements were relevant. He remembered small things. The uji. Once, when I had described my mother's morning kitchen, I mentioned that she made uji with a specific quality of patience that I associated with Sunday mornings. 3 weeks later, he arrived at the volunteering center with a thermos. He placed it beside my materials. He said, "I looked up the recipe. I am certain it is not right. But I thought the intention might count for something. It was not right. But the intention counted for considerably more than something." He respected my culture without performing respect, which is a distinction that matters. There is a quality that some people develop when they are being respectful of a culture that is not their own, that communicates the performance of respect rather than the thing itself. An over-carefulness, a quality of someone managing their behavior for your benefit. He was not careful. He was curious. There is a difference. Curious people make mistakes and ask questions. Careful people make no mistakes and offer no questions because they are too occupied managing the impression they are creating. He asked questions. He got things wrong and found out he had gotten them wrong and asked how to get them right. And he applied what he was told. He was not perfect. I want to be honest about this because a story about a man who is perfect is not a story about a human being and is therefore not useful to anyone sitting with a real human being in a real relationship. He was occasionally too much in his own head. He had a tendency, in the evenings when he was tired after a difficult day at work, to become quiet in a way that I occasionally misread as withdrawal, when it was simply his version of processing. I learned this over time, not immediately. He told me something about his parents that helped me understand it. We were walking beside the Han River on a Saturday afternoon in March, when the spring was beginning its gradual assertion over the winter, and the air had the quality of something that is almost but not yet warm. He said, "My parents were together for 34 years. I said, "That's a long time." He said, "It is." They were physically present with each other for 34 years. He paused. He said, "I grew up watching two people share a house and a life and not actually share anything." I looked at him. He said, "They were not unkind to each other. There was no dramatic failure. They simply existed in separate emotional atmospheres in the same space. And I grew up inside that and understood very early that staying somewhere is not the same as being present in it." I said, "And that's why you..." He said, "That's why staying somewhere matters to me in a different way than it might to someone who grew up watching people actually show up for each other." We walked, the river doing its January thing of simply being the river, broad and unhurried. I said, "Does it frighten you that you might do the same thing?" He said, "It used to. Now it frightens me less because I know what to watch for. The specific way I go quiet when I should speak. The specific way I begin managing my interior instead of sharing it." He looked at the water. He said, "I tell you this so you know I am not simply a person who shows up. I am a person who has to choose to show up, and I do. But I want you to know it is a choice rather than a quality." That conversation rearranged something in me. Not immediately, but in the way of things that have been placed somewhere inside you, and that your interior is moving toward understanding, even when your surface has not yet caught up. He was not simply good. He was good in the particular way of someone who had examined the alternative and made a decision. That was more valuable to me than the other kind. We began what I suppose was dating sometime in April, not with announcement, with the gradual understanding that what had been building for 6 months had arrived somewhere that required a name. He asked once whether we were something. I said, "What would you call what we are?" He said, "Something I want to continue." I said, "Then let's continue it and work out the name later." He smiled. He said, "That is a very practical approach to romance." I said, "I am a very practical person." He said, "I know." He said it in the way of someone who knew a great deal more about what that sentence meant than the surface of it suggested. The difficulty, when it arrived in the way that real relationship difficulty tends to arrive. Not as one enormous thing, as the accumulated pressure of many small things that have been building toward a moment of release. I had been managing my vulnerability in the relationship the same way I managed everything. With precision, I was present, I was warm. I offered enough of myself to sustain the connection without offering enough to make myself genuinely vulnerable to loss. I did not know I was doing this with him. I knew it in the abstract. I could describe the pattern to Zainab on Sunday calls with complete accuracy. But inside the relationship, inside the actual daily experience of being in something with another person, I was doing exactly what I had always done. Giving enough to maintain, withholding enough to be safe. He noticed. Not in a way that required a confrontation, not in the way of someone who had been tracking evidence and was now presenting it, in the way of someone who simply sees clearly. He said once, after an evening that had been warm and enjoyable, and that had ended with me declining to stay overnight for the fourth consecutive time, each time with a reason that was logistically plausible. "Can I ask you something without it becoming a disagreement?" I said, "That depends on what you're asking." He said, "Is there a version of this where you're actually here?" I said, "I am here." He said, "I know. That's not what I mean." I said, "Then what do you mean?" He said, "I mean here, not present in the room, here, in this." The silence that followed was the kind of silence that contains a great deal. I said, "I am trying." He said, "I know you are. I can see it. And I'm not asking you to try differently. I want you to know that you don't have to manage this. I'm not going anywhere." I looked at him and felt something that I did not immediately have a name for. Not gratitude, not warmth, something more inconvenient than those. Terror. Because the thing I was most afraid of was not someone leaving, it was someone staying, and meaning it. The argument happened in June. He received an opportunity through work, a collaborative project with a city in the Netherlands that required a 6-month presence in Amsterdam. He told me the evening he received the offer. He said, "I wanted you to know before I decided anything." I said, immediately and without thinking, "You should go." He looked at me. I said, "It's a good opportunity. You should take it." He said, "I haven't decided yet." I said, "You should decide yes." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "1 euro." I said, "What?" He said, "What are you doing right now?" I said, "I'm telling you to take an opportunity that is clearly good for your career." He said, "No." "What are you actually doing?" I looked at him. He said, "You're ending this. Before it ends. You're deciding the outcome of something that hasn't been decided yet, so that you can be the one who decided it." The accuracy of this landed somewhere that I felt in my body before I felt it in my mind. I said, "That's not what I'm doing." He said, "Then tell me what you're doing." I said, "I'm being realistic." He said, "About what?" I said, "About the fact that 6 months is a long time and these things don't." He said, "Don't what?" I didn't finish the sentence. He said, "These things don't last? Is that what you were going to say?" I said nothing. He said, "You keep deciding how this ends before we even get to choose. You have already written the ending and handed me a role in it, and you haven't asked me what I actually want to do." He said, "What if I don't want to go?" I said, "Then you'd be giving up something good." He said, "For something better." The apartment was quiet. He said, "I want to be here. I am choosing to be here. Can you let me make that choice without taking it from me?" I said, "I am not taking anything." He said, "You are. Every time you get close enough to something real, you find a way to dismantle it first. And I have been patient with that because I understand why it happens and because I believe it can change. But I need you to understand that this is a pattern, Wanjiru. And I cannot stay in something where you have already decided it fails." He did not leave. He sat on the sofa and looked at the window. And I went home. I walked through Seoul at 9 o'clock in the evening, and I let the city do what Seoul does at 9 o'clock on a summer evening. It continued. Cars and people and the specific quality of a city that has never heard of my problems and would not pause for them if it had. I came home to my apartment. I stood in the doorway, everything organized, everything controlled. The furniture in the positions I had chosen, the books arranged in the system I had developed, the kitchen clean because I had cleaned it before I left and had not been home since, everything in its place, and I stood in the doorway of the most organized space I had ever inhabited and understood something. My life was not empty because I was alone. My life was empty because I had never allowed anyone enough space to truly belong in it. I had made room for myself. I had not made room for another person. And there is a difference between a life that is full and a life that is occupied. I called Zainab. It was 2 a.m. in Nairobi. She answered on the second ring. I said, "Did I wake you?" She said, "Yes." I said, "I'm sorry." She said, "No, you're not. Tell me." So I told her. Not the managed version. Not the version I had been giving people for years where the story was coherent and the ending was already resolved before I began telling it. The actual version. The one where I did not know what came next and I was frightened by the not knowing, and I was more frightened by the reason I was frightened. Zainab listened. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. She said, "Wanjiru." I said, "Yes." She said, "You know you have been telling me this story for 10 years. Different people, different cities, same ending." I said, "I know." She said, "What's different this time?" I said, "I don't want the same ending." She was quiet. She said, "Say that again." I said, "I don't want the same ending." She said, "Then go tell him that." I said, "What if he's already?" She said, "Go tell him that. And stop finishing sentences about how things end. You don't actually know how things end. You've only ever run before you found out." I said, "That is a very accurate thing to say to someone who is already frightened." She said, "I know. That's why I said it." She said, "Wanjiru, you are one of the strongest people I know. You have built your life with your own hands in ways that most people do not have the courage to attempt, but you have confused strength with armor, and armor is very useful in a battle, but you have been wearing it at dinner." The apartment was very quiet. I said, "I don't know how to take it off." She said, "Yes, you do. You're doing it right now." She was right. I went to see him the following evening. He opened the door with the expression of someone who had been waiting without knowing they were waiting. He said, "Come in." I came in. We sat in his kitchen. He made tea. And I sat at his kitchen table and thought about what I was about to do, not with the performance of someone delivering a prepared speech, with the honest terror of someone who has spent 31 years building a specific way of being in the world and is about to say the thing that contradicts the foundation of it. I said, "I'm scared." He looked at me. I said, "Not of you, not because of anything you've done." He waited. I said, "I'm scared because I trust you. And I have spent my entire adult life avoiding being in a position where trusting someone could hurt me. Because if you trust someone and they leave, you have 2 losses. The person and the trust. And I didn't know if I could survive 2 losses at the same time." He was very still. I said, "So what I have been doing is staying far enough away that if you left, I would only have 1 loss, the person, but not the trust, because I hadn't given enough of it to lose." I said, "But what I didn't understand is that staying far enough away to not be hurt is the same thing as staying far enough away to not be there. And I have been managing a relationship with you the same way I manage everything, with enough given to maintain but not enough given to matter. I said, and I don't want to do that anymore. He said, what do you want to do instead? I said, I want to be here, actually here, not managing it, not protecting the exit. He said, that's going to be uncomfortable for you. I said, I know. He said, you're going to want to leave before it gets hard. I said, I know. He said, and I need you to not do that. I said, I know. He said, can you do it? I said, I don't know. I think I can try honestly rather than trying carefully. I don't know if that's the same thing. He said, it is. Trying carefully is managing. Trying honestly is actually trying. He reached across the kitchen table. He took my hands. He said, I'm not going to Amsterdam. I said, Seongjin. He said, I already declined the offer. 2 days ago. I said, why didn't you tell me? He said, because I wanted to see what you would do. Not what you would say, what you would do. I looked at him. He said, you came here. I said, you turned down Amsterdam. He said, I know. We're both doing something. I said, I don't need you to give things up for me. That's not. He said, I know it isn't. I gave it up for me. Because what I want is here. And I am allowed to choose what I want. You're not the only one who gets to make that decision. I said, you're very frustrating. He said, I know. He said, Wanjiru. I said, yes. He said, you don't need saving. You never did. You have never once needed someone to rescue you from anything. I said, then what did I need? He said, someone to stay. Someone to still be here when you finally decided to be here too. The kitchen was very quiet. I held his hands, and I let myself do the thing I had been preventing myself from doing for the full length of my adult life. I stayed. Years later. We are married, not in the way that stories use weddings as their climax and their resolution. The wedding was a single afternoon, beautiful and warm and full of the people who had been present through the building of everything that preceded it. Zainab flew from Nairobi and cried from the moment she arrived at the venue. My mother sat in the front row and held her handbag in both hands with the composed expression of someone who has known something was coming for long enough that its arrival is not a surprise, but a relief. Ji Young, who had been watching the whole story unfold with the satisfied investment of someone who considers themselves a contributing factor, spent the entire reception looking between us with an expression that communicated she was taking appropriate credit. It was a good afternoon. But the ending of this story is not the afternoon. The ending of this story is a Tuesday morning in our apartment in Mapo. 7 months after the wedding. He is at the kitchen counter making coffee with the familiar ease of someone who has made coffee in this kitchen enough times that the familiarity has become simply the condition of the morning. I am at the kitchen table with my laptop and the planning documents I have been working through since 6:30, because the project I am managing has entered the phase that requires early mornings and detailed attention and the specific quality of focused work that I have always been very good at. He places the coffee beside my laptop. He does not announce it. He does not require acknowledgement. He simply places it there, the same way he placed the first cup beside my materials at the volunteering center 2 years ago. And I look up, and he is already moving toward the door with his coat and his keys. He turns. He says, "I forgot my phone." He comes back. He picks up his phone from the counter. He passes my chair. He pauses. He places his hand briefly on my shoulder and leaves. The apartment is quiet. I look at the coffee, and I think about all the things that a cup of coffee placed beside your work without announcement can contain. How much ordinary daily evidence of love accumulates in the small, consistent gestures of someone who has decided that you are the thing they show up for. Again and again and again. I used to think love had to prove itself through the grand version, through the gesture that could be photographed and the moment that could be described at gatherings. I understand now that the greatest proof is often the unremarkable kind. Someone who remembers how you take your coffee, someone who waits when you are walking slowly, someone who comes home, not once, every day, and has organized their life around the fact of coming home. That is the proof. I did not need saving. I had already learned how to save myself. Long before Seoul, long before him, long before the specific Tuesday evening in his kitchen, when I finally said the true thing out loud. I had learned to carry my own weight, to solve my own problems, to walk through hard things without asking the world to slow down for me. That learning was real and it was valuable, and I do not regret any of it. What I regret is what I did with it. I turned it into a wall and called the wall independence. I turned it into distance and called the distance strength. I turned it into preemptive grief and called the grief self-protection. And I was for a long time very convincing about it, even to myself. What I understand now that I did not understand for 31 years is this. Being strong does not mean you have to be alone. Independence is not the same as isolation, and the capacity to walk through difficult things by yourself is not an argument against having someone beside you when you walk through them. Both things can be true. You can be capable of carrying your own weight and also willing to share it. You can be someone who has learned to survive alone and also someone who has chosen not to. Because surviving alone and choosing to be with someone are not opposites. The first is a capacity, the second is a decision. And the decision does not diminish the capacity. It is simply what you choose to do with it. The sentence my mother gave me when I was 8 years old was true. If you can do something yourself, don't wait for someone else to do it. But there is a companion sentence she did not give me, not because she withheld it, because I was not ready to receive it yet. The companion sentence is this: just because you can do something alone does not mean alone is the version you are required to choose. You are allowed to want company. You are allowed to want someone to stay. And wanting that does not make you less capable. It makes you honest. I spent years learning how to walk alone, and perhaps that was necessary. The walking teaches you things that stillness cannot, about your own endurance, about the quality of your own company, about the specific character of who you are when you are not performing for anyone. But the greatest thing my life has taught me is this: being able to walk alone does not mean you have to. I did not need saving. I needed someone to stay. And eventually I learned something even more important. I learned how to let myself stay, too. Not in a place, in something, in the specific, unremarkable, extraordinary dailiness of a life that belongs to two people who chose each other, repeatedly. In the coffee placed without announcement, in the hand on the shoulder on an ordinary Tuesday, in the coming home, again and again. and again. Thank you for being here, for staying with this story through every act of it. If something in it found you, if it found the part of you that has confused strength with armor, or independence with isolation, or the ability to walk alone with the requirement that you must, then it did what it was made to do. Subscribe. Because there are more stories where this one came from. Stories about the women who built their own walls and the slow, patient work of learning to open a door in them. About the ordinary love that shows up every day without ceremony. About the most important thing any of us ever learn. That strength is not the absence of need. It is the courage to name what you need and to let it arrive. New stories as oftentimes. I will be here.